The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of former President Mitchell's study as he reviewed the documents one final time. These papers had been locked away for years, their contents too explosive to share until now. Mitchell ran his hand over his gray hair and took a deep breath. At 72, he had nothing left to lose, and the American people deserved to know the truth. 3 hours later, he sat under the bright studio lights of the National Broadcasting Network. The interviewer, a veteran journalist named Rivera, adjusted his tie nervously. They both knew this wasn't going to be a typical political interview about memoirs or legacy. We're live in 5, 4, 3. The floor director's countdown ended in silent finger gestures. Good evening, America. Tonight, we have former President James Mitchell joining us for what he has described as the most important interview of his career. Rivera's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his anxiety. Mr. President, thank you for being here. Mitchell nodded, his expression grave. Thank you for having me, Tom. I've come forward today because I believe our democracy depends on transparency. What I'm about to share may shock many Americans, but the truth can no longer stay hidden. With careful movements, Mitchell reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. These documents show a troubling connection between Victor Blackwood, the financier who died in prison 2 years ago, and numerous high-ranking officials across multiple administrations. The camera zoomed in on photographs showing Blackwood with cabinet members, senators and foreign dignitaries at private estates and on a private island, flight logs with familiar names highlighted in yellow, bank transfers with numbers that made even the veteran interviewer's eyes widen. I began collecting this evidence during my second year in office, Mitchell continued, when intelligence reports crossed my desk suggesting Blackwood was not merely a wealthy businessman, but the center of an influence operation targeting our government. Across town, in the residence of the White House, President Robert Harrison watched the broadcast in stunned silence, his dinner growing cold beside him. His chief of staff stood frozen by the door, phone clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Sir," she whispered, "press is already calling. They want a statement." Harrison didn't respond, his eyes fixed on Mitchell's next words. Blackwood created a sophisticated system, the former president explained, showing diagrams of connections. He identified powerful individuals with certain appetites and provided them with what they wanted. Then he documented everything. Rivera leaned forward. "Are you suggesting blackmail, Mr. President?" "I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it as fact." Mitchell's voice remained calm, but his eyes flashed with anger. Blackwood controlled people through compromise and threats, and some of those people made critical decisions affecting national security, financial regulations, and foreign policy. In living rooms across America, people sat forward on their couches. On social media, the interview was already trending nationwide. In newsrooms, editors scrambled to prepare special editions. Why now? Rivera asked the question on everyone's mind. Why wait until years after leaving office? Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "Fear, Tom, I was afraid. These people have enormous power. I tried working through proper channels, but the corruption went too deep. After Blackwood's death, I received this." He held up a sealed envelope. Insurance files from Blackwood himself, delivered by his attorney. A dead man's switch. The interview cut to commercial, but no one moved from their screens. In bars and restaurants, conversations had fallen silent as patrons watched. At a campaign fundraiser in Chicago, donors checked their phones under the table, ignoring the congressional candidate at the podium. When the broadcast resumed, Mitchell was explaining the extensive reach of Blackwood's network. This wasn't just American officials. We're talking about prominent figures in finance, entertainment, foreign governments, people trusted with enormous responsibility. He pushed forward a photograph showing Blackwood on his private jet with 3 men whose faces were instantly recognizable to most viewers. This was taken 2 days before The Simpson. Energy bill failed in committee, Mitchell said pointedly. A bill that would have cost Blackwood's energy holdings millions. In the White House Situation Room, hastily assembled advisors watched in horror. The communications director was already drafting potential responses, none of which seemed adequate. "President Harrison needs to address this immediately," insisted the vice president, her face pale in the blue light of the screens. Back in the studio, Rivera asked, "Have you spoken with President Harrison about these allegations?" I attempted to, Mitchell replied. 3 times over the past month. My calls were not returned. The camera cut briefly to Rivera's surprised expression before returning to Mitchell, who continued without missing a beat. I want to be clear, this is not a partisan issue. Blackwood's network included people from both major parties, from every administration dating back 30 years. This is about power and corruption, not politics. Outside the NBN building, a crowd had begun to gather. News vans with satellite dishes lined the street. Police officers established a perimeter, unsure what to expect but sensing the historical weight of the moment. Inside his Manhattan penthouse, billionaire investor Lawrence Kent, one of Blackwood's former associates, made 3 phone calls in quick succession, then ordered his assistant to prepare the private jet. By morning, he would be in a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. What happens next? Rivera asked as the hour-long special neared its conclusion. Mitchell squared his shoulders. I've delivered copies of everything to the FBI director, the Attorney General, and select members of Congress whom I believe are not compromised. I've also secured copies with international partners and trusted journalists, to be released if anything happens to me. The implied threat wasn't lost on anyone watching. Do you fear for your safety, Mr. President? Mitchell smiled sadly. I'm an old man, Tom. I've lived my life. But yes, these are dangerous people. That's why I've chosen to do this publicly. The American people are now my protection. As the interview ended, the camera lingered on Mitchell's weathered face. He looked tired but unburdened, like a man who had finally set down a heavy load after carrying it too long. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the Mitchell files and Blackwood network were trending worldwide. News anchors struggled to maintain composure as they reported on the breaking story. Political analysts were called in from dinners and bedrooms to provide urgent commentary. At his country estate, Senator Wilson, chair of the Intelligence Committee, received the secure package Mitchell had mentioned. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal and began reading. By the 3rd page, he was on the phone to the FBI director. Is this verified? He demanded. We're analyzing it now, came the tense reply. But the preliminary assessment is, it appears authentic. President Harrison remained conspicuously silent. No statement came from the White House that evening, despite the press secretary being bombarded with calls. The official line was that the president was reviewing the situation and would address the nation when appropriate. This silence spoke volumes. By midnight, international news agencies had picked up the story. British, French, and Japanese officials mentioned in the documents were already issuing denials. The Russian president made a cryptic comment about American hypocrisy finally being exposed. In a modest suburban home outside Washington, a mid-level Treasury official named Thompson stared at his television in shock. He had flagged suspicious transactions linked to Blackwood 5 years earlier, only to be reassigned to an obscure department. Now he wondered if his career had been sabotaged to protect the network. The next morning, Americans woke to newspapers with identical headlines: Mitchell's bombshell. Television programs canceled regular programming for continuous coverage. People called in sick to work to follow developments. Mitchell himself had been moved to a secure location, surrounded by private security. His adult children issued a statement supporting their father's decision to come forward. Our father has always taught us that courage means doing what's right, especially when it's difficult, the statement read. We stand with him now as he demonstrates that courage. As dawn broke over Washington, President Harrison finally emerged from the White House to board Marine One. His face was ashen, his movements stiff. He ignored shouted questions from the press corps as he climbed the steps to the helicopter. The nation held its breath, waiting for his response. But the silence from the president continued, becoming more damning with each passing hour. And in secure servers around the world, the full Mitchell files waited like digital time bombs, ready to reveal even more explosive connections that would shake the foundations of power across the globe. The unexpected disclosure had begun an unstoppable cascade of revelations, and no one, not even Mitchell himself, could predict where it would end. The morning after Mitchell's explosive interview, America woke to a changed political landscape. News channels ran non-stop coverage, cycling between clips of the interview, expert panels, and reporters stationed outside key government buildings. The documents Mitchell had revealed were being analyzed by journalists worldwide, each revelation sparking new questions. These flight logs confirm Blackwood's private jet made 17 trips to his island with government officials on board, explained a veteran investigative reporter on Morning America. She pointed to highlighted dates on the screen. And look at the timing. 3 days before the Henderson trade deal collapsed, 1 week before the Asian banking regulations were mysteriously weakened. Social media buzzed with screenshots and video clips. Ordinary people became amateur investigators, connecting dots between events they remembered and the revelations now coming to light. Some connections were coincidental, but others were disturbingly plausible. In a downtown Washington coffee shop, 2 Justice Department lawyers huddled over their laptops, speaking in hushed tones. "Have you been called in yet?" asked the younger one, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept. "Briefing at noon," replied her colleague, scrolling through pages of flight manifests. "They're assembling a special task force. This goes beyond anything we've handled before." Across town, Mitchell's chief of staff during his presidency, a gray-haired man named Reynolds, faced a wall of microphones outside his home. "Yes, I was aware the president was gathering information," he admitted, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "No, I didn't know he planned to release it this way, but I support his decision completely." When asked why he hadn't come forward himself, Reynolds paused. "Fear," he finally said, echoing Mitchell's own words. "These people don't just ruin careers, they ruin lives." By mid-morning, the first photographs began circulating online. Images from Blackwood's island estate showing powerful figures in compromising situations. Business leaders with known criminals, a Supreme Court justice on Blackwood's yacht, a beloved philanthropist accepting a suspicious package. Cable news producers faced difficult decisions about what they could show on air. Standards departments worked overtime reviewing content. Anonymous image boards had no such constraints, and the unfiltered photographs spread like wildfire through encrypted messaging apps. At the New York Times office, editors gathered around a conference table covered with printouts. "We need to verify everything independently," insisted the executive editor. A veteran journalist with 40 years of experience, Blackwood was known for manipulation. Some of these could be doctored. A tech reporter nodded in agreement. "I've sent the digital files to 3 separate forensic analysts, but preliminary results suggest most are authentic. Metadata, lighting analysis, all consistent with the claimed dates and locations." In Silicon Valley, the CEO of a major tech company watched the coverage from his glass-walled office, recognizing several industry colleagues in the background of Blackwood's photographs. He picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer. "We've never met," he said when the call connected. "Blackwood invited me to that conference, but I declined. I need you to issue a statement making that absolutely clear." President Harrison remained conspicuously absent from public view. The White House press secretary faced an increasingly hostile briefing room. "The president is thoroughly reviewing all information and consulting with his national security team," she insisted, her knuckles white as she gripped the podium. "He will address the nation when he has a complete understanding of the situation." But was he aware of these connections before Mitchell's interview? Shouted a reporter from the back row. "Has he ever met Victor Blackwood?" Called another. The press secretary ended the briefing abruptly, ignoring the barrage of questions as she exited. By early afternoon, international reactions poured in. The British Prime Minister announced an immediate inquiry into mentioned officials. The German Chancellor expressed grave concerns and promised full cooperation with American authorities. Several smaller nations recalled their ambassadors for consultation. Only Russia's response carried a hint of amusement. "Perhaps now our American friends will be less eager to lecture others on corruption," their foreign minister remarked dryly. At his secure location, Mitchell received a steady stream of calls. Former staffers, journalists, even a few current officials speaking off the record. His security team had tripled after anonymous threats appeared online. His lawyer fielded requests for interviews from every major network worldwide. The president will not be speaking again until the proper authorities have had time to review his evidence, the lawyer announced. To the press gathered outside. This was never about publicity. It's about truth. Not everyone viewed Mitchell as a hero. Critics quickly emerged, questioning his timing and motives. Why now? Why not when he was in office with the power to do something? Demanded a popular talk show host. And convenient that he waited until Blackwood was dead and couldn't defend himself. A former intelligence official appeared on an evening news program with his own theory. Mitchell is settling old scores, he claimed. This is political theater designed to distract from his administration's failures. These criticisms gained traction among certain segments of the population. By evening, small but vocal protests had formed outside Mitchell's former campaign offices in several cities. Social media was divided between those celebrating Mitchell's courage and those questioning his character. In a university lecture hall, students gathered for an impromptu discussion led by a political science professor. What we're witnessing, she explained, is the tension between institutional stability and moral imperatives. Mitchell violated norms by releasing classified information, but if the system itself is corrupted, do those norms still serve the public good? A student raised his hand. But how do we know which parts are true? Blackwood was a convicted criminal. Maybe he fabricated evidence to implicate innocent people. Excellent question, the professor nodded. This is why journalists, courts, and independent investigators are crucial. Truth emerges through verification, not accusation. Meanwhile, more concrete evidence continued to surface. Bank records showing suspicious transfers between Blackwood's shell companies and offshore accounts linked to political action committees. Email exchanges with coded language that took on new meaning in light of the revelations. A retired FBI analyst appeared on nighttime television to explain the patterns. What you're seeing is classic compromise and control, he said, diagramming connections on a digital board. Blackwood created situations where powerful people crossed lines, legal, ethical, moral. Then he owned them, and they just went along with it? Asked the host. The analyst smiled grimly. Power makes people believe they're untouchable. By the time they realized they were trapped, it was too late. In Chicago, a federal prosecutor named Clark reviewed a case she had been forced to drop 3 years earlier. A money laundering investigation that had mysteriously hit wall after wall. Now with Mitchell's revelations, the obstructions made perfect sense. She began pulling the old files from storage, sensing a second chance at justice. As midnight approached, a surprising development broke. A junior White House staffer named Price announced his resignation effective immediately. His statement, released through an attorney, was brief but explosive. I can no longer in good conscience serve this administration. What former President Mitchell has revealed only scratches the surface of what some in this White House have known for years. Price disappeared from public view immediately after, reportedly leaving the city with family members. White House officials scrambled to dismiss him as disgruntled and unreliable. By the next morning, the story had entered a new phase. Citizen groups organized rallies in major cities demanding full investigations. Legal experts debated potential charges. Conspiracy theories flourished alongside legitimate reporting, creating a chaotic information environment that left many Americans struggling to separate fact from fiction. In New York, financial markets reflected the uncertainty. Stocks connected to Blackwood's former business empire plummeted. Investment firms mentioned in the documents faced client withdrawals. Economic analysts warned of potential systemic effects if the scandal continued to widen. We're seeing a crisis of confidence, explained a financial news anchor. Markets can handle bad news, but they hate uncertainty. And right now, no one knows how far this goes or who might be implicated next. In Los Angeles, a renowned filmmaker announced he was already developing a documentary about the Blackwood network. In Nashville, a country music star released a song called The Island that thinly referenced the scandal. The revelations were being absorbed into American culture even as they continued to unfold. Meanwhile, President Harrison finally emerged from seclusion to attend a previously scheduled economic forum. He read prepared remarks about infrastructure investment without acknowledging the scandal, then left without taking questions. The awkward appearance only intensified criticism of his silence. That evening, as Mitchell's revelations entered their third day, a new dime. Tension emerged. International intelligence agencies began confirming portions of Mitchell's claims from their own sources. A British newspaper published diplomatic cables showing their government had warned American officials about Blackwood's activities years earlier. In her Georgetown townhouse, a retired intelligence officer named Sullivan watched the coverage with grim satisfaction. She had submitted reports about Blackwood's network during 3 different administrations, only to see them buried each time. She picked up her phone and made a call to a journalist she trusted. "I have records," she said simply, "and I'm ready to talk." As a new day dawned, Americans awakened to headlines announcing that the Senate had formed a special investigative committee with subpoena power. The first hearings would begin within days. Mitchell would testify, as would Reynolds and others from his administration. The White House was notably absent from the initial witness list, but few believed that would last. In his private study, President Harrison reviewed polling data showing his approval rating in free fall. His advisors were divided, some urging full cooperation with investigations, others pushing for executive privilege claims to block inquiries. The president himself seemed paralyzed by indecision, his legendary confidence shattered by secrets he had never expected to become public. As Mitchell had said in his interview, the truth could no longer stay hidden. And as the evidence mounted and the aftermath spread, it became increasingly clear that American politics would never be quite the same again. A week after Mitchell's initial revelations, what had begun as a domestic political scandal exploded into a global crisis. The morning headlines in Washington looked almost identical to those in London, Berlin, and Tokyo. Blackwood Network International Connections exposed. In the wood-paneled chamber of the Senate Special Committee, Mitchell sat calmly at the witness table, flanked by his attorneys. Camera flashes punctuated the tense atmosphere as the committee chairwoman, a stern-faced senator with 3 decades of public service, called the hearing to order. "We face an unprecedented situation," she began, her voice carrying throughout the hushed room. "The allegations made by former President Mitchell suggest corruption at the highest levels of not just our government, but governments worldwide. Our duty to the American people demands we uncover the full truth, regardless of where it leads or who it implicates." Mitchell's testimony lasted nearly 6 hours. He methodically walked through the evidence, explaining connections that spanned continents and decades. The committee members listened with expressions ranging from shock to grim vindication. Blackwood didn't limit his operations to American soil, Mitchell explained, directing attention to documents displayed on screens throughout the chamber. His network extended to at least 27 countries. "What you're seeing here is correspondence between his organization and officials in the British Parliament, the European Commission, and several Asian finance ministries." Outside the hearing room, public interest had reached fever pitch. Lines to enter the public gallery had formed before dawn. Viewing parties gathered in homes and bars across America. Global news networks provided live translations in dozens of languages. At the United Nations headquarters in New York, an Emergency Security Council session had been called. Representatives from countries implicated in the Blackwood Network publicly demanded investigations while privately making frantic calls to their capitals. "We cannot allow these allegations to undermine the critical work of this body," insisted the Secretary General, though the strained expressions around the table suggested it already had. In London, 3 members of Parliament announced their immediate resignations, citing personal reasons just hours before a British newspaper published documents connecting them to Blackwood. The Prime Minister, facing questions about his own potential involvement, called for a period of calm reflection that was immediately mocked on social media. The French president appeared on national television to denounce what he called American political theater, only to be confronted the next day with photographs showing his finance minister at Blackwood's Swiss chalet during a suspicious tax policy change. Global financial markets, already unsettled by the domestic revelations, now entered a period of significant volatility. The International Monetary Fund issued an emergency statement assuring member nations that the fundamental stability of the global economy remains sound, but trading floors told a different story. "We're seeing massive repositioning," explained a financial analyst on Bloomberg TV. "Investors are pulling out of companies and sectors with any hint of connection to the Blackwood Network. It's not panic yet, but it's heading in that direction." In Beijing, government censors worked overtime to block news about Chinese officials named in Mitchell's documents. In Moscow, state television ran stories suggesting the entire scandal was an American plot to distract from domestic problems. In smaller nations whose leaders had been implicated, Public protests grew in size and intensity each day. Back in Washington, former allies began distancing themselves from Mitchell. His former vice president, now running a global nonprofit organization, issued a carefully worded statement expressing surprise and concern about Mitchell's methods. While transparency is essential to democracy, the statement read, "Releasing classified information outside proper channels risks national security and sets a troubling precedent." Others were less diplomatic. Mitchell's former Secretary of State appeared on a Sunday morning talk show, visibly angry. "I served beside him for 6 years," she fumed. Not once did he mention these investigations. Not once did he share these concerns with his national security team. He operated a shadow intelligence operation from the Oval Office, which is precisely what he accused his predecessors of doing. The host pressed her. "Are you suggesting he fabricated evidence?" "I'm suggesting," she replied carefully, "that his narrative is self-serving and incomplete. The American people deserve the full story, not just the parts that cast him as a hero." This criticism gained traction, particularly after documents emerged showing that Mitchell had blocked several congressional inquiries into Blackwood's businesses during his presidency, citing national security concerns. Critics now painted these actions as deliberate obstruction to keep his investigation private. At his secure location, Mitchell watched these former allies turn against him with resigned acceptance. "I expected this," he told his daughter during a rare secured call. "They're afraid of what else might come out. They should be." As the second week of revelations began, the international dimensions grew even more complex. Interpol announced a coordinated operation across 12 countries, with raids on properties linked to Blackwood's estate. Swiss authorities froze dozens of accounts connected to the network. In the Cayman Islands, financial regulators began an unprecedented audit of shell companies mentioned in the documents. The global nature of the scandal created unexpected diplomatic tensions. Countries that had been fierce rivals found themselves uncomfortably united by shared corruption. Traditional allies discovered reasons for mutual suspicion. Intelligence sharing arrangements that had functioned smoothly for decades suddenly became fraught with distrust. At NATO headquarters, an emergency meeting of defense ministers turned contentious when evidence suggested Blackwood had influenced military procurement decisions across the alliance. The German representative demanded to know how American intelligence had missed or ignored such extensive corruption. "Perhaps," he suggested icily, "our American friends were not the victims of this network but its beneficiaries." The American Secretary of Defense, a decorated former general, bristled visibly at the accusation. "Careful, Wilhelm. Your own defense ministry doesn't exactly have clean hands here." As international tensions rose, President Harrison remained largely invisible. His public appearances were brief and tightly controlled. He read prepared statements that acknowledged the serious nature of these allegations. While promising a thorough and independent investigation, he took no questions and offered no substantive comment on his own potential connections to the Blackwood network. This leadership vacuum created space for new voices. Congressional representatives not implicated in the scandal jockeyed for position as moral leaders. Governors issued statements promising state-level investigations. Retired judges and prosecutors appeared on television offering analysis and criticism. Then came the moment that transformed the domestic political landscape. White House staffer Price, who had resigned in the scandal's early days, resurfaced with his attorney at a press conference in a downtown hotel. The room was packed beyond capacity. Price, looking pale but determined, adjusted his glasses and began to read from prepared remarks. "I joined this administration believing in President Harrison's vision for America," he said, his voice initially shaky but growing stronger. "I was proud to serve my country, but within months I witnessed disturbing patterns that I could not ignore." Price described late-night meetings with visitors who never appeared in official logs, classified documents about the Blackwood investigation that were mysteriously rerouted, explicit instructions to avoid mentioning certain names and companies in policy discussions. "The final straw came 3 weeks ago," he continued. "I was directly pressured by the Chief of Staff to alter records of a National Security Council meeting, where Blackwood's financial connections were discussed. When I refused, I was removed from my position and transferred to a meaningless role. The White House immediately dismissed Price as a disgruntled former employee with a history of performance issues. But documentation Price provided to the Senate committee told a different story. His performance reviews had been exemplary until his sudden transfer. His security clearance had been impeccable. More damaging, two other staffers came forward the following day with similar accounts. Then a mid-level State Department official. Then a Pentagon analyst. The trickle of whistleblowers threatened to become a flood. Public demonstrations grew larger and more frequent. What had begun as small gatherings outside government buildings swelled into massive rallies in major cities. People carried signs reading "Truth Now" and "No One Above the Law." Counter-protesters appeared as well, defending Harrison and questioning Mitchell's motives, but they were consistently outnumbered. On university campuses, students organized teach-ins about government corruption. In religious communities, leaders spoke about moral courage and ethical governance. In corporate boardrooms, executives ordered comprehensive reviews of any historical connections to Blackwood's vast business empire. The scandal penetrated every level of American society. Local news stations reported on community leaders with ties to Blackwood's network. School boards discovered educational grants with strings attached to Blackwood-funded foundations. Charitable organizations found troubling conditions in donations they'd accepted years earlier. International coverage took on distinct regional characteristics. European media focused on the financial crimes and regulatory failures. Asian outlets emphasized governance breakdowns. Middle Eastern channels questioned the selective nature of which regional connections were being exposed, and which remained hidden. Then came another unexpected development. The Attorney General, who had been leading the Justice Department's official investigation, announced her immediate recusal, citing previously unknown connections between her former law firm and Blackwood's estate. Her deputy, appointed to take over, lasted less than 8 hours before similar connections emerged. The Justice Department faced a leadership crisis at precisely the moment its independence was most crucial. President Harrison, forced to address the situation, appointed a special prosecutor, a retired federal judge with a reputation for fierce independence. The choice was widely praised, a rare moment of political consensus in the growing chaos. The special prosecutor wasted no time. Within days, federal agents executed search warrants at offices connected to Blackwood's network. Former associates found themselves facing grand jury subpoenas. Immunity deals were offered to those willing to cooperate. In this atmosphere of escalating legal jeopardy, international figures began turning on each other. A French banking executive implicated his British counterparts. A Canadian mining magnate provided documents showing how Blackwood had manipulated resource contracts across 3 continents. A Japanese technology billionaire revealed a complex scheme involving intellectual property theft and market manipulation. The circle of complicity widened with each new revelation. What had first appeared as isolated corruption now revealed itself as systematic capture of global institutions. Financial regulations, trade agreements, environmental policies, security arrangements, all showed fingerprints of Blackwood's influence. Mitchell watched these developments from his secure location with mixed emotions. The truth was emerging just as he'd hoped. But the scale of the corruption exceeded even his understanding. The network was more extensive, more deeply rooted, more damaging than he had realized. "We were all blind," he confided to his longtime security advisor, "even when we thought we were seeing clearly." As the 3rd week of revelations began, public pressure on President Harrison reached a critical point. Congressional leaders from both parties called for him to address the nation candidly. Allied governments demanded clarity about American leadership. Financial markets required stability that only transparency could provide. Harrison finally agreed to a primetime address from the Oval Office. The announcement sent anticipation to unprecedented levels. Would he confess connections to Blackwood? Would he resign? Would he attack Mitchell's credibility? The political world held its breath. The evening of the address, Americans gathered around screens large and small. Viewing parties formed in homes and public spaces. News networks prepared special coverage with expert panels ready to analyze every word and expression. At precisely 8 p.m. Eastern Time, the presidential seal appeared on screens nationwide. The camera pulled back to reveal President Harrison seated at the historic Resolute desk, his expression grave. My fellow Americans, he began, his voice steady despite the enormous pressure. I come before you tonight to address the serious allegations that have emerged regarding Victor Blackwood and his network of influence. What followed would change American politics forever. And no one, not Mitchell, not the special prosecutor, not the American people, could have predicted exactly what the president would say, or the international earthquake it would trigger. President Harrison's address to the nation began with the expected platitudes about the seriousness of the allegations and his commitment to truth. For the first 5 minutes, political analysts exchanged knowing glances. This would be another carefully crafted non-statement, revealing nothing of substance. Then, unexpectedly, Harrison's tone shifted. I cannot in good conscience continue to address these matters with diplomatic language, he said, setting aside his prepared remarks. The camera caught his press secretary's alarmed expression from the side of the room. The American people deserve better than carefully worded evasions. In living rooms across America, people leaned forward, sensing the historic weight of the moment. Yes, I knew Victor Blackwood, Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength, not merely in passing as previous statements from this office have suggested, but through multiple meetings both before and during my presidency. The admission sent immediate shockwaves through newsrooms. Producers scrambled to update breaking news banners. Social media exploded with reactions. However, Harrison raised a hand. These meetings were not what former President Mitchell has implied. I met with Blackwood as part of a counterintelligence operation that began during Mitchell's own administration, an operation he has conveniently failed to mention in his revelations. In his secure location, Mitchell watched with narrowed eyes, immediately calling his former intelligence director on a secure line. Did you know about this? He demanded. Harrison continued his unexpected narrative. For over a decade, elements within our intelligence community have been tracking Blackwood's network, mapping its connections, understanding its methods. This work began under President Collins, continued through Mitchell's administration, and expanded during mine. He lifted a folder marked with classified stamps. I have here, with proper clearance from our intelligence agencies, documentation proving that Mitchell was briefed on this operation no fewer than 7 times during his presidency. The political earthquake intensified. Mitchell's supporters and Harrison's critics paused, struggling to process this new information. If true, it would mean Mitchell had strategically omitted crucial context from his revelations. Why would a counterintelligence operation exist without arresting Blackwood? Asked a CNN anchor, voicing the question on millions of minds. Harrison addressed this directly. Blackwood's network was so extensive, so deeply embedded in global institutions, that moving against him prematurely would have triggered financial collapse and diplomatic chaos. The operation's goal was to document the entire network before taking action. He paused, his expression grave. I take full responsibility for continuing this approach rather than pursuing immediate arrests. That decision was based on national security assessments that I believed were sound. Whether that judgment was correct is for history and the American people to decide. The address continued for nearly an hour as Harrison detailed the government's long-term operation against Blackwood. He acknowledged meetings with the financier, but characterized them as necessary for maintaining the intelligence operations cover. He admitted receiving campaign donations from Blackwood's legitimate businesses, but claimed these were deliberately accepted to avoid tipping off the network. As Harrison spoke, fact-checkers worked frantically to verify his claims. Government officials not involved in the Blackwood operation expressed shock and confusion. Foreign leaders demanded to know if their governments had been informed about this alleged counterintelligence work. The speech reached its climax when Harrison made a stunning announcement. In light of these extraordinary circumstances, I am today appointing a bipartisan independent commission with full access to classified material. Their mandate is to determine not just the extent of Blackwood's network, but also to evaluate the decisions made by 3 administrations, including my own, in response to this threat. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting the camera directly. If this commission finds that I abused my office, concealed evidence, or acted to protect corrupt interests rather than national security, I will resign immediately. The address ended with Harrison looking visibly exhausted but resolute. The immediate reaction was chaos. Commentators struggled to process the president's claims. Supporters and critics alike recalibrated their positions, and the public tried to determine whom to believe. Within hours, Mitchell held his own press conference, flanked by former intelligence officials from his administration. President Harrison has attempted to rewrite history, he began, his voice tight with controlled anger. The briefings he referenced were about limited financial irregularities, not an extensive counterintelligence operation. If such an operation existed as he described, it was concealed from me and my senior team. Mitchell's former director of national intelligence nodded in confirmation. I would have known about an operation of that magnitude. We were tracking aspects of Blackwood's activities, yes, but nothing approaching what President Harrison described. The dueling narratives created profound public uncertainty. Both men could not be telling the truth, at least not completely. The American people found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to determine which of their leaders was more credible, or whether both were selectively sharing information to protect themselves. Congressional leaders from both parties issued a joint statement announcing they would subpoena all intelligence records related to Blackwood, spanning 3 administrations. The special prosecutor expanded his investigation to include potential obstruction of justice by officials in both the Mitchell and Harrison administrations. International reactions reflected similar confusion. Some foreign governments claimed they had indeed been informed about American intelligence operations against Blackwood. Others denied any knowledge. A few suggested their own intelligence services had been tracking Blackwood independently, creating a narrative of uncoordinated global surveillance. As the competing claims dominated headlines, Mitchell made his most dramatic move yet. In a late-night announcement that caught even his closest advisors by surprise, he released an additional trove of documents, what he called the complete record of his investigation into Blackwood. I had hoped to spare certain individuals from public exposure, he explained. People who were victims of Blackwood's methods rather than willing participants. But President Harrison's mischaracterization of events leaves me no choice but to release the full documentation. The new files contained transcripts of conversations recorded in Blackwood's properties, email exchanges between Blackwood and officials who had not yet been implicated, financial records showing patterns of influence across industries and governments. Most explosively, they included detailed information about how Blackwood had compromised specific individuals through bribery, blackmail, and more insidious methods. The documents painted a picture of a man who understood human weakness and exploited it systematically. Legal experts debated whether Mitchell had crossed a line by releasing information that could compromise ongoing prosecutions. Privacy advocates worried about the implications of exposing victims alongside perpetrators. Intelligence professionals warned about damage to sources and methods. Despite these concerns, the public impact was immediate and profound. The documents provided context that had been missing from earlier revelations. They showed how Blackwood had created a layered system of corruption, with some officials knowing they were part of something illegal, while others were manipulated without fully understanding what they were enabling. Most significantly, the new documents directly contradicted key elements of Harrison's address. They included communications proving Harrison had met with Blackwood before any counterintelligence operation could have been established. They contained records of policy changes that benefited Blackwood's interests in ways that could not be justified by national security concerns. Harrison's carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. Former members of his campaign team came forward with accounts of direct coordination with Blackwood's organizations. A retired Treasury official revealed how investigations into Blackwood's finances had been repeatedly derailed through political pressure. Public opinion, which had been divided and uncertain following Harrison's address, shifted dramatically. Polls showed growing support for Mitchell's version of events and declining trust in Harrison's explanations. Calls for the president's resignation appeared on editorial pages that had previously urged caution and due process. International pressure mounted as well. Allied leaders who had initially accepted Harrison's counterintelligence explanation now demanded concrete evidence. Financial markets, briefly stabilized by the president's address, entered new turbulence as investors lost confidence in the administration's transparency. The White House responded with increasingly desperate measures. They released selective intelligence reports supporting Harrison's claims. They highlighted inconsistencies in Mitchell's timeline. They questioned the authenticity of some documents in the latest release. None of these efforts gained traction. Each defensive statement was met with new revelations that further undermined the president's credibility. Junior staffers began resigning in growing numbers, unwilling to defend positions they no longer believed. The breaking point came 7 days after Harrison's national address. The Attorney General, who had temporarily returned from recusal to review classified material, held a somber press conference at the Justice Department. "Based on my review of all available evidence," she stated, her voice steady despite the enormous implications of her words, "I have determined that a special grand jury must be convened to consider potential criminal charges against current and former government officials, including those at the highest levels." She did not name Harrison specifically, but she didn't need to. The legal and political establishment understood immediately that the Attorney General was signaling her belief that the president had committed indictable offenses. Harrison's remaining allies urged him to fight, to maintain his innocence, to challenge the legal process as politically motivated. For 48 hours, the White House issued no official response as these debates reportedly raged behind closed doors. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Harrison appeared in the White House Rose Garden with his family. His face was drawn, his posture rigid. The gathered press corps fell silent as he approached the microphone. "I have always believed that public service is a sacred trust," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion or exhaustion. "When that trust is broken, or even when it appears to be broken, the foundations of our democracy are weakened." He paused, looking briefly at his wife, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Therefore, effective noon tomorrow, I will resign the office of President of the United States." The announcement, though increasingly expected, still landed with seismic force. Harrison would be the first president in modern history to resign amid allegations of corruption. The constitutional succession would elevate his vice president, a woman who had maintained careful distance from the Blackwood scandal and was generally viewed as uninvolved. In his resignation speech, Harrison maintained that many of his actions had been misinterpreted or taken out of context. He insisted that he had always acted in what he believed was the national interest. But he acknowledged that the country needed healing that could not occur while he remained in office. "I choose to step aside not as an admission of the allegations against me, but as an act of patriotism," he concluded. America must move forward. The public reaction was complex. Relief that the immediate crisis of leadership would end. Uncertainty about what additional revelations might emerge. Concern about the unprecedented nature of the situation and its implications for democratic institutions. In the 24 hours between Harrison's announcement and his official departure, Washington experienced a strange, suspended animation. Government functions continued, but every action took place in the shadow of imminent change. Foreign governments issued carefully worded statements respecting America's constitutional processes while privately preparing for new diplomatic relationships. As Harrison prepared to leave the White House for the final time, Mitchell held a brief press conference at his home, having finally returned from his secure location.